Welcome to Cultural Anthropology Terms. I'm your hostess, Crazy Aunt Nay. In this segment, we will go over some terms that will be critical as we go throughout many episodes in the series. By way of background, I will share my bachelor's degree is in anthropology. I am also certified in applied cultural anthropology. What does that shit mean? It means I took many courses on culture. I also took sociology courses, statistics, and a variety of other classes that will aid in our discussions. That means I'm more of an expert on this subject than any of your high school teachers. There are many concepts in the current culture war discussions that are bastardizing terms and concepts that come from anthropology and sociology and twisting them into their weirdo cult language. In order to discuss that and identify what's going wrong there, you need to understand these terms and concepts in their correct context and form. So let's get going. Let's start with a simple definition of each term, and then I will give you context and examples to understand these more clearly and correctly. This episode might be a little bit longer, so take it in multiple parts if you want to, but just my little disclaimer up front. So it's going to be a little mini anthropology course. All right, so first term, culture. Behavior particular to Homo sapiens together with material objects used as an integral part of this behavior. Thus, culture includes language, ideas, beliefs, customs, codes, institutions, tools, techniques, works of art, rituals, and ceremonies, among other elements. One's culture is therefore obtained beginning at birth by the geographical area, community behaviors, standards and norms, traditions and learned knowledge that we as Homo sapiens pass down to our children in order to provide them with the most knowledge and information to survive and be successful in the environment. This is partially why customs, clothes, and all other things will be dramatically different for peoples on, say, tropical islands than people who live in the Arctic regions. Think about that when we talk about culture. The term culture is overused and used incorrectly all of the time. Based on what we discussed, do you think a person can define their own culture? No is the correct answer. Can a person change their culture? No is also the correct answer. You can learn different ways of doing things, learn different behaviors, and choose to adopt things that are outside of the culture in which you were raised. And all humans can do this. That does not mean you have now changed the culture in which you were raised. Anyone saying differently is 100% wrong. Ethnocentric, evaluating other peoples and cultures according to the standard of one's own culture. This is a term that is taught very early on in an anthropology program, especially if you're talking about cultural anthropology. The best way to put it is the term is similar to egocentric. What does an egocentric person do? They see themselves as the center of the universe, and they see themselves as superior to everything and everyone else. Being ethnocentric means you see your culture rather than yourself that way. A good example is in early ethnologies, which are studies and written information about studied cultures. Anthropologists who made this mistake would write about the savages or primitive or wild men of whom they were studying, assuming their culture was so advanced and knowledgeable compared to whom they were studying. This attitude changed over time, and the word was developed to warn against this practice. What they failed to observe in these cultures because of their ethnocentrism was their vastly superior knowledge in medicines, hunting techniques, and living strategies in a geographic space that made living more comfortable and efficient in the area. Therefore, it is scientifically a major mistake to study another culture through this lens. Evolution, the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the Earth. This term is also overused and used poorly. Evolution refers to a specific process we can see in nature that allows for species to adapt and thus survive many changes in environment and external impacts to the species. We will talk about this more in a moment. First, let's learn about the father of evolution, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a biologist studying the natural world and observing how species developed. He was the author of The Origin of the Species. He was not the only scientist writing about the same subject, and he was not the only one observing the same phenomenon in nature at this point in time. But his work on The Origin of the Species had major scientific impact in its day. Darwin did not, however, say that man came from apes. This is attributed to him because he was the forerunner in observing the evolutionary process that was the basis for this claim later. The Origin of the Species talks about two groundbreaking things that at his time in history were shocking, but that we now take for granted in observing the world around us. These are natural selection and survival of the fittest. Natural selection, the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. Darwin observed this at the Galapagos Islands, where he saw birds whose main diet was a specific type of insect. The birds would pull out of the cracks in rocks to eat. As the island was changing, the cracks were getting deeper. Only the birds with the longest beak could reach down to get the insects. The birds with the beaks that were too short died off. As the long-beaked birds bred with other long-beaked birds over time, the beak length for these birds became the longer version. Eventually, there was enough difference in the original bird and the longer-beaked bird that they would be classified as a new species. Around this same time, Gregor Mendel was doing his work with plants. You may or may not have learned about Mendel, but to spare you a long college class lecture, he was the plant guy who was noticing the same thing in plants as Darwin was in mammals, and he spliced plants to genetically alter them. These things are common practice today, both with plants and animals. People can create plants with specific flower color or attributes. Dog breeds are bred specifically for attributes that make them extremely different from each other. These domesticated dog breeds are not found anywhere in nature, are they? This practice was considered blasphemy in their day, as the church taught that every single animal, plant, or human had a specific and unique creation from God that could not be altered, changed, or observed in such a way. Obviously now, we simply take this for granted that this is how the world works. That is all Darwin said. Another observation that is critical to this process is survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is the natural process by which organisms best adjusted to their environment are most successful in surviving and reproducing. This goes hand in hand with natural selection. Survival of the fittest does not mean the strongest in terms of size, speed, or any other assumed subjective characteristic. It simply means the best adapted for the situation. This could be the smallest that survives and is the most fit for a given situation, or simply the one with the longest beak, shortest arms, etc. Body modification. Intentional, permanent, or semi-permanent alterations of the living human body for reasons such as ritual, folk medicine, aesthetics, or corporal punishment. In general, voluntary changes are considered to be modifications, and involuntary changes are considered mutilations. Many cultures in history and today practice body modification for a variety of reasons. Everything from tattoos, neck rings, earrings, gauges, or circumcision, or feet binding. There are many reasons and many stories we could go into in this section, but it's important to be aware what this means and that it is an actual area of study in anthropology. Language evolution. Language evolution is the application of evolutionary theory to the study of language. I wanted to discuss this term because it is important to understand that languages do evolve. However, natural language evolution and purposefully changing a language for control and dominance are two very different things. And a third thing altogether is constantly changing a language and definitions in order to create confusion and lack of understanding. As Homo sapiens, one of our greatest evolutionary traits was the ability to develop complex language that allowed for us to understand each other. Not just for basic survival communications, as other species do this very well also, but on a deeper level that made us as a group more able to work in concert for the whole tribe or community. That created greater safety, defense, and allowed for generational learning. Language and the ability to create tools are the key components in what allowed us to surpass all other species on Earth as the head of the food chain. This is also what started to lead to cultures. Language does have a natural evolution, but you need to recognize the difference between this and bullshit. Language evolution will always lead to greater understanding and simple understanding between people. It will not create greater confusion and lack of understanding. This is another example of things that are mutually exclusive. An example would be going into a company or industry and actively working on changing all the industry terminology for no purpose other than wanting to own the name of the term. In other words, nothing changed about the process. We just want to call the same thing XYZ that was ABC for decades. Does this help or hurt understanding and productivity? If you said hurt, you're right. That is what makes this bullshit and not language evolution. Bias, a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing. Bias is by far the most misunderstood and bastardized term from the anthropology toolbox. We need to understand this well so you can understand when you are hearing bullshit. Bias is neither good nor bad. That's the first myth. This term has been misused so badly that when people hear the word bias, they automatically think it's negative. And worse, racist. If someone is using it that way, they're an idiot. Let me explain by way of example. Let's pretend there are two people who have never eaten a strawberry before. They have never heard any information about strawberries, good or bad, to give them any predisposition either way. The first person eats a strawberry and it's super sweet and delicious. The second person eats a strawberry and it's tart and sour. These two people now have a very different bias towards strawberries and whether or not they like them. Now let's say the first person eats another strawberry and it's tart and sour. They are more likely to try a third, having had the original positive experience from their first berry. In contrast, the second person may never try another strawberry again. Now let's say the second person hears from a lot of friends and family, people they trust, that strawberries are actually very good and they should give it another try. They may do so. If the second berry is sweet and delicious, they may change their bias quickly based on the fact that they can reason and the second experience was what they were told it should be, and that aligned. But let's say their second berry is tart and sour again. They may never try a third. And their bias that strawberries are gross will be further entrenched. Person 1 has a bias that strawberries are delicious. Person 2 has a bias that strawberries are gross. A disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing. Bias is what it is. It's important to be self-aware enough to know what your biases are in order to be able to remain neutral on a subject if you're using a scientific approach to something. We'll discuss in greater detail in the first episode why implicit and explicit bias is utter bullshit. But you are probably already smelling that downwind. Cult. A system of religious veneration and devotion directed towards a particular figure or object. Elements of a cult include a cult leader who is charismatic, authoritarian leadership, group over individual, critical thinking not allowed, us versus them mentality, it is difficult for a member to leave the group, sexual exploitation of members, a culture of lying and deception, financial exploitation of members, salvation can only be experienced, achieved through the group, isolation of members from family or anyone who is likely to expose the group, a culture of double standards. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. I also think it is pretty evident when one is looking at a cult. However, some people have trouble with this when the cult isn't just a weirdo compound type of situation. Cults can be large or small. They can be religious-based or based on other ideology that people can be convinced of. Modern-day examples are the Nazis, especially the SS, the KKK. Some people think Scientology or the Jehovah's Witnesses are cults. We're going to have an episode soon in the first season called The Cult of Ibram Kendi, because this whole anti-racist and woke culture movement is undeniably a cult. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is the condition of having or being composed of different elements. Variety. Equity, the quality of being fair and impartial. Inclusion, the act or state of including or of being included within a group or structure. These are the definitions of the individual terms. Each term on its own has been used in anthropology and sociology type studies. Each term on its own is pretty straightforward, and no one really has a problem with any of those, right? Let's look at them again slowly. So these on their own are not objectionable, right? Now let's take a look at an example of how the commies morph the language and definitions in order to weaponize them in a way that people, primarily the Americans, cannot speak out against them or they appear to be bigoted. Here's the definition of DEI as a cult word and a cult idea. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are organizational frameworks which seek to promote the fair treatment and full participation of all people, particularly groups who have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination on the basis of identity or disability. This definition has now changed diversity from the condition of having or being composed of different elements, variety, to particularly groups who have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination, thereby limiting diversity to specifically not include anyone who is not in a historically underrepresented group. In other words, if you're white, you're out. You don't get to be part of the variety that is being discussed. They change equity from the quality of being fair and impartial to organizational frameworks which seek to promote the fair treatment and full participation of all people, particularly, again, implying if you are not part of what the cult defines as anything after particularly, you're not included. This is the funniest and most ironic one. They change inclusion from the action or state of including or of being included within a group or structure to full participation of all people, particularly groups who have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination on the basis of identity or disability. The minute the word particularly is said, you are now literally not speaking about all people. You are now adding a term that is giving preference to particular groups, which then specifically excludes whites, straight men, Christians, Americans, and anyone they want excluded. The cult decides who is in and who is out. DEI is racist, unfair, and excluding by design. This is an example of cult speak. We will dive into this more in depth in future episodes. These are the basic terms and concepts you need for a real foundation, an objective scientific foundation for us to build on as we get into the nitty-gritty of what is going very wrong in the country and what Gen Z can do about it. Remember, the focus on this podcast is to empower you with the relevant information and facts you need in order to understand what is happening and how you can seize control of it to define your future instead of having it assigned to you.